I've got to be honest, before we even get into the talk for today, I had more of you pegged as marathon runners than, I just thought some of you are like, no, absolutely, he, she, you, I just thought you would be in the race today. And some of you are like, Ben, you need to even know why I'm at church, period. Your spouse or your friend or your roommate said, hey, you either have to run the marathon or you're going to church. And so you took the lesser of two evils, and whatever reason you're here, hey, I hope this won't feel like a marathon. By the time that I'm done, we'll keep you at an hour-ish, and you'll be good to go. I hope that you're doing well. Summer rolling along for everyone. We're getting a heat wave this week. Some of you excited about that a little bit? Anybody excited? You know, there are only, if you love the heat so much, there are only 1 million other cities in the U.S. you should live if you love the heat so much in this time of year. You guys know, if you've been around Epic for a long time, that outside of God calling us here to start this church, the climate really is the number one reason I'm here. So give me 55, maybe 63 with a light breeze, but that's kind of where I max out, and so that's why I'm here. The rest of you, I have no idea why you're here. When you have 1 million other places you could live and get a sunburn in the summer. But you're like, no, Ben, I just go to the East Bay. Like every afternoon, I go to the East Bay. The car climbs from 67 in San Francisco to 97 by the time I get to Walnut Creek, and it's awesome. I'm not going to Walnut Creek, not till like December. Glad that you're here. We're going to wrap up the This Is Our God series here in just a moment, but I want to give you a couple of just things to know about that are coming up. Starting next week, we're going to begin a series called Rooted. It's about a 7-week series. It'll go from August 2nd through September 13th. And if you've ever been like me and so many, even our staff and our leaders, like you wish there was some more consistency in your faith. You wish you weren't treating your faith like we often do as a hotel, checking in constantly and checking out quickly, like I've got, like it's some business trip or something. What the Rooted series is going to do, we're going to look at a parable for the most part in that series and see what the ingredients are for living a more grounded or a more rooted and consistent life. And so there's some principles that we're going to unlock. And Jesus names 4 different kinds of people in the parable of the sower, and though none of us like to be pigeonholed, every one of us are in that parable. And so what we want to do is help each other discover, where am I, what leads to my inconsistency, or what could lead to some great fruit being played out and lived out and born in my life. One thing that he says at the end of the parable, just to give a little bit of it away, he says you can live and be rooted in such a way that your life will produce fruit that is 30x, 60x, and 100x. Now, I'm not a venture capitalist, but if I could guarantee you those odds, I think many of you are going to buy in. Anybody want 30 times the return on their money? Anybody? Yeah, that's some people are like, Ben, I don't know. Is that good? That's awesome. And that's like the lowest Jesus gives. He's like, you could do 30x to 100x. Come on. All right. And then we get a little bit greedy. Like, I want the 100. Well, we'll find out how we can put ourselves in a predicament, in a situation, how we can live a life rooted in such a way in Christ that what he produces in us is so far beyond what we could produce in our lives ourselves. Second thing, and Will alluded to this, is we are trying to, and this is an annual thing for us, we know that those who serve in the Epic community really make up the backbone of who our church is. And so we are not shy about letting you know over these 3 weeks that we're trying to recruit 100 new volunteers to serve in our church. This is how our church has moved forward from day one, and this is how our church will continue to move forward. And so you're like, Ben, there are so many more people now, I don't need to volunteer. No, that's the whole point. Because there are more people, and more people are going to come as we gear up for the fall, we want to say, hey, as Jesus said, I didn't come to the earth to be served, but to serve. We won't even make you live out the Jesus statement, okay? We just want to adopt a portion of it, though. What if we said, not so big and audacious as Jesus saying, hey, I'm not even here to be served, I'm just here to serve. What if we adopted for our statement, why we're a part of this community, is, hey, I'm in this community to be served, but not only to be served. I'm in this community to be served, but also to serve. And I hope that you are served and you feel like you've been served well just by being a part of this community, but it's time to not just take output from this community, it's time to put some input into this community. And so we're never going to shy away or apologize for urging 80%, 100% of us in our church to roll up our sleeves and find a team or an area of ministry where we can contribute, because we either are completely consumers or we can consume something, but also we need to realize we're contributors. And so we're going to push on that. We're not going to apologize for that. You're like, Ben, I don't have any gifts. What can I do? I don't have any gifts, and I'm the pastor. So there's something for you to do within the Epic Church community. But today we are going to put to rest our series in the Psalms that we've been calling This Is Our God. Some of you we haven't seen all summer, and so we just want you to know we're here. We've been here. Some of us don't have really cool homes on the other side of the United States. Some of us haven't taken really awesome trips to Asia. Some of us haven't, gone to Hawaii 6 times and just sort of trying to figure out which island is best. Like, some of us have just been here. And we feel a little like we're more Christian than you are. And the reason is we didn't have a choice to leave. Like, we couldn't even go anywhere. And so here we are. From a very early age, we have learned how to celebrate moments in our lives when we realize that we have what it takes. From a very early age, the first time you could dress yourself without assistance from your mom or dad, that was a big deal. And you didn't care, and you didn't even know you weren't matching. You didn't know that you don't wear cowboy boots with gym shorts that are different colors. You just knew you could do something yourself, and that felt well accomplished. The first time you and I learned to ride a bicycle without the help of training wheels, that was a big deal. And for the first time, once we learned how to do that consistently, we're like, okay, I have what it takes. But what you and I know is that this isn't just a kid thing. In fact, this sort of thing stays with us from the time we discovered early on, and it stays with us for the most part for the rest of our lives. We love walking into moments, experiencing things, and coming up against things where we're like, you know what? Wow, I have what it takes. And if I just give us permission for a moment just to be a little bit arrogant, I mean, the fact that we live in San Francisco or in the Bay Area during this time, we kind of have what it takes, right? Anybody feel elitist when you talk to your friends from other places? Do you feel elitist at all? Anybody? Listen, all right. This is church. You don't have to tell the truth the rest of the week, but when we come to church, anybody else? You're like, man, my family, and you have friends that are like, I talked to my brother this week, and he used to live here, which makes it even worse. You know, it's bad to know how something is and be somewhere else than to not know how it is and be somewhere else. And he's like, man, yeah, life is good for the family. The heat is just killing us. I was like, man, I know what you mean. Like, I totally resonate with that. It's killing you. But do you feel a little bit elitist when you're like, yeah, I have what it takes? Some of you are like, Ben, I got a note from my landlord. I'm not sure I'm going to have what it takes in 3 months. But right now, I am here. I have what it takes. But can we be honest? The reason why the market's so hot and heavy, the reason why prices are so high is because this place is severely in demand. And congratulations, you have what it takes. Some of you are like, Ben, you don't understand the hostel I'm living in right now and how many people are in my studio apartment. I guess I have what it takes, but somehow, and however you made it, right? You were smart. You inherited a ton of money. I mean, however you made it, like right now, at least you're somewhere in the Bay Area, except for those of you who are visiting from out of town. And to you, we just say, we're sorry. Enjoy what we get to enjoy every day, if you can. But it's true. We get this sense of accomplishment, like, wow, I have what it takes. But we've all lived long enough, and if you haven't, you're headed there soon, to know that there are times where we run into moments where we realize we don't have what it takes. And what do you do then? When you run into a situation, when you run into something where you no longer have what it takes. The worst is not trying something new and realizing you don't have what it takes. Some of us who've been in this, we can attest, the worst is knowing that in this certain thing, I used to have what it took, and I no longer have what it takes. That's the worst. But hopelessness sets in because we all of a sudden come up against something and we realize this: we aren't enough. We aren't smart enough. We aren't wealthy enough. We aren't innovative enough. Anyone heard that one? We aren't connected enough, maybe even in a church leadership role. We're not spiritual enough. We just aren't enough. And what happens when we come up against something where we realize that we aren't enough, what we typically do is begin to scale down our pursuits for what kinds of things we're willing to go after. We begin to scale the things down because it just makes sense to us. But here's what a question I want to ask us today that I think could unlock a whole new future for us as individuals and even as a church. What if we don't have to live a life that we have to be responsible for? What if we don't have to live a life where we have to be able to personally handle the input and the outcomes of that life? What if we can live a life where God's willing to take responsibility for some of it or all of it? Wouldn't that open up a whole new set of possibilities? And what I want to say to us today is that if this psalm that Eugenia just read, Psalm 121, if it is true, then not only is it possible to live a life beyond your responsibility, I think it's the life you've been called to live, and I think it must break the heart of God when he's willing to take responsibility for my life and your life, and we're like, no, God, I'm only going to pursue the things that I can handle on my own. See ya. It must break the heart of God when he's going, wait, you guys know how I've worked through history, and yet you don't tap into it. Think about your favorite Bible stories. You're like, Ben, I don't have any, but I remember the one about the giant. Okay, let's just start there. We don't love our favorite stories in the scriptures because we're like, that was inspiring. That person only went after what they could handle on their own, right? Those things aren't in the Bible. No, we love stories about the runt in the family who defeated the giant and one day became king. That's the story we love, right? Why? Because he was able to tap into something beyond his own responsibility. He was able to go after something for the sake of many people beyond what he could handle himself. Daniel in the lion's den. I mean, if that guy only can do what he's responsible for, he's lunch for the lion. He's not waiting there the next day when the king comes like, what's up? I don't know. These guys are just sort of purring. They're sleeping. Why? Do we love that story? Because he went after something he couldn't handle on his own. And he didn't have to resign himself, but many of us in this room have resigned ourselves to the things that we can handle ourselves. And some of you, let's be honest, there's a lot you can handle yourself. And so you're like, Ben, I'm way up here. But here's what I want to submit to you today. If Psalm 121 is true, if God is this for us, if he relates to us in this way, then there are people in this room who don't have capabilities that other people have in this room and in our city and in the world, and you will be able to experience more in your life because you realize early on, I don't have what it takes, but there's a God who's willing to assume responsibility for my life. One of the craziest questions we get, it's not crazy so much, it's a frequent question that our church staff has gotten from day one when we go other places and people want to know, like, what's the story? It's really like they're wanting us to tell them what amazing things that we've done. And here's what they do that just blows my mind. They're like, hey, except for the God favor part, tell me how you guys did this. Like, man, let me think. Okay, I'm awesome. The staff is awesome. We found some desperate people in San Francisco. No, that's not it at all. I'm like, I don't really have much of a story if you take out the God part. And some of you aren't getting in on the God part at all. And what I want to urge us to today, I believe God's got a word for us today. I want us to begin to push into a space in our lives and as a church and in our careers where if God doesn't do it, it won't happen. Some of you are like, but Ben, I can handle a lot on my own. I know, and you people, you really talented, you really wealthy, you really well-accomplished people, you're the ones who will be the last to get into this if you don't begin to believe Psalm 121, because there's so much you can do without the help of God. So what do you do when you run into something where you don't have what it takes? Is it time to scale down your pursuit? Or can you tap into, embrace a God who's willing to take responsibility for things that you cannot handle yourself? The psalmist begins this great chapter and he says, I lift my eyes up to the hills, or your translation may say mountains. And here's what's happening. He, like so many of the nation of Israel, he is headed on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for a feast or some kind of celebration, or at least to worship. He's headed to Jerusalem. And the reason he says, I lift my eyes up to the hills is because of the elevation of Jerusalem. Anytime someone was headed to Jerusalem for worship, they were always going up. Like, this isn't like, Ben, is this a spiritual metaphor? No. Physically, Jerusalem was up high, and so they're ascending anytime they're headed to Jerusalem, and when they would leave Jerusalem, they were always descending, no matter which way they went, because of the elevation of Jerusalem. And so he's saying, I lift my eyes up to the hills, and then he asks, where will my help come from? Will my help come from the hills? He's reminding himself that, no, that's not where my help comes from, and he answers this question and says, my help comes from the Lord. But before we get there, let me ask you, and this functional question, not like, oh, what's the church answer? Where does your help come from? If I could observe your life, like I could have all access to your life, that's not scary at all, is it? Or if you could have all access to my life, that's terrifying. You would be able to answer this question for me, and I would be able to answer this question for you. Does that make sense? Like I could just observe your life and go, oh, that's where she looks to for help. When things aren't going well, oh, that's what he does or she does. They tend to work longer hours. They tend to drink too much. They tend to eat too much. They tend to shut down. They call this person. They try to escape. Like, if we saw each other's lives, I would know and you would know how we all answer this question. Where does my help come from? But we don't have that kind of access to each other's lives, for the most part at least. And so you've got to answer this question for yourself. And remember, let's always start in a place of honesty, even if we're seeking to be or live differently. So who's your go-to helper? What or who do you go to for help? Is it your network? Is it your net worth? Is it your career? Is it working harder? Is it escaping? Is it eating or drinking too much? Is it trying to pray more? I mean, where do you go when you need help the most? And the psalmist is just going, listen, where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. What he's doing there is reminding himself of the resume of his helper. He's like, yeah, I guess if this God is responsible for all of heaven and earth, maybe, just perhaps, I should let him take responsibility for me. Anybody? And everybody's like, no, Ben, I'm more complex than heaven and earth. You don't understand. I've got issues. God knows that. And so it's like, no, the Lord is my helper. And so no surprise here, this is what I want to urge us to, but the psalmist doesn't get this right all of the time. You and I don't get this right all of the time, but we need to remind ourselves or introduce ourselves for the first time that the Lord is our helper. He is the one who made heaven and earth. I think he can handle the big things we're trying to attempt. Some of you are like, but Ben, God doesn't know this yet, but I've got the best new idea, technology thing. I won't even try to say it because I don't even know what you guys do. You're like, who gave you that idea? Oh, man, I'm just brilliant. Okay. And here's what I want to say early on. I wanted to say this for the end, but I think it's when we celebrate the moments where we realize we have what it takes, and then we get to moments where we realize we don't, and we're hopeless, and we're not enough, and we bow out, and we quit, and we scale down our pursuits. Here's what I want to say. One of the problems you and I have is that when it looked like we had what it takes, it wasn't us actually having what it took in and of ourselves. You're like, no, Ben, you don't understand. I went to the right university, and I got this great job. I'm like, well, how did you get into that university? You're like, well, I killed the standardized test. I mean, I was hanging out with Princeton Review 4 nights a week, but I killed the standardized test. Okay, who gave you the brain for that? Oh, man, I got 23 chromosomes from my mom. I got 23 chromosomes from my dad. I'm thankful I didn't get their other chromosomes because my parents are a little crazy, but I got the good ones, and I am smart because of that. Oh, great. How did your parents get that? Well, my grandparents must have been. And any way you go back, however far you want to go back, eventually what you're going to find is the source of all the things that you thought you were up to the task for, you weren't responsible for. You won't take your next breath if he doesn't allow it. And so one of the things that can help us going into greater pursuits, it isn't just saying, hey, when you get up against something you can't handle. No, it's saying, hey, whatever God has given you, the reason you're alive today is because he's put breath in your lungs. The scriptures say he's created you in his image, and he's created you for a purpose, and he wants to fulfill that purpose. But if you don't step into something beyond what you can handle yourself, I believe you'll never fulfill the responsibility and purposes that God has given your life. Again, none of us read Esther's story and go, man, I'm so glad she played it safe and kind of stuck to what she could deal with herself. No, we're like, man, when she could have been killed by the king, she went for it, and God opened something up and saved the people. Paul in the first century, we love his story. We're not like, oh, man, Paul, of course that makes sense that he just dialed down his pursuits. No, he wanted to kill Christians, and then he becomes the man responsible for moving the mission of God forward in the first century. Some of us feel like we're going so much after it in the world, and the reality is all we're doing, even though we have great capacity, all we're doing is going after what we can attain to or handle ourselves. So the psalmist says, this is where our help is. It's found in the Lord. And then in verses 3-8, he tells us how the Lord helps us. And it's interesting. It's not a verb that I would use if I was writing the Bible. Surprise, surprise. I would write it differently. But he uses a verb, and it occurs 6 times. It kind of brings the rest of the text together. It's the verb in Hebrew, shamar, and it's the verb that's translated in our Bibles in English either as keep or guard. So if you just look through the 3-8, you'll see 6 different occurrences of a verb and one time a noun of this word that relates to keeping or guarding. So verse 3, he who keeps you. Verse 4, he who keeps Israel. Verse 5, the Lord is your keeper. There's the noun. Verse 7, he will keep from all evil. Also verse 7, he will keep your life. Verse 8, the Lord will keep your going out and your coming in. And so that is, it's like, I don't know that I would choose that thing, but that's when the psalmist says, how does God help me? How does God help you? The way he does it is by keeping or guarding. I think guarding is a better word in terms of our English because it's more active in my mind than keeping. But whatever way you think of it, the idea is he's actively guarding or he's actively carrying, protecting, keeping, and guarding us in our lives. And that, again, it shows up 6 times in those 6 verses, and so it's something we need to pay attention to. When you're reading the Bible and you come across something that's repetitive, there's a reason why it's there, and so we need to sink our teeth into that. And he says the big deal about how God helps us is by keeping us or by actively guarding us. Even when you get to verse 5, and he says, the Lord is the shade at my right hand, the idea of shade is protection. The shade protects us from the sun, and that's the same image he's using there, that God is like our shade. He protects us from all these other things that he goes on to mention in the text. Now, what's interesting to me, if I thought about how are the ways that God helps me, I would come up with a list. You would come up with a list, but I don't think I would get to what he hints at in verses 3 and 4. He doesn't hint at it. He makes it really explicit. He says one of the very best ways God helps us is by not going to sleep. Anybody like, how is that helpful? Like, God, if you're anything like me between 2 and 5 a.m., I mean, even though you're God, how good is God even from 2 to 5 a.m.? You know what I mean? He's like, no, to put it in a positive way, the fact that God stays awake is really helpful for us. As I see 3 of you not being able to stay awake right now, that's doesn't do anything for my insecurities. I'm just like, God, they were tired. It's not a boring talk. They just need rest. God, give them sleep. We'll send dirty emails tomorrow, but today, God, just let them rest. I know you watch the podcast, so you doze off in here, but you watch it later by video. One of the best things the psalmist says that God gives us is the fact that he stays awake. But him staying awake doesn't seem to guarantee anything just because he's awake. What I want to do is make sure we understand 2 components that come together in God, and if they aren't true or if we don't believe they're true, then we're really not going to be helped by the God who stays awake. And the 2 components are the power of God and the desire of God to help us. And what I want you to show you, if you just think one of the 2 of these is true, then it really isn't going to help us at all. So let's assume that God has the power to help us, but he doesn't have a desire to help us, then this would be true. God can do something for us, he just refuses to. Or if you think you've got a God who's all lovey but has no power, he's got a desire to help, but he doesn't have the power to help, then here's what you would know to be true, that God wants to do something to help you in your situation. He just can't. He's just not strong enough. He's just not powerful enough. And so when his power and his desire come together in our minds and hearts as they are in reality, all of a sudden it's like, okay, now I understand why Paul would say things like, hey, we can see God do more than we can ask or imagine. We can see God do some amazing things. God can take care of us, and he wants to take care of us. And that's a phenomenal thing. If you've not embraced that this morning, that's something you need to embrace. Some of you are like, I don't have any doubt about God. I just have a doubt about me, and so I don't think he loves me. Others of you are like, man, God might be all sweet and stuff, but I don't think he can do anything about the situation I'm in. And here's what you and I know to be true. However we answer the question, from where does my help come, whatever that answer is, that is who or what we're looking to do something about our situation in life, period. That's who we're looking to. And so he's like, hey, look to God. He can do something. He has the power and he has the desire to help us. And he just keeps rolling through the Psalms. But a question I think that we need to ask is, how big is the space that God promises to actively guard us in? Like, does God just give me 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon? Like, he's got me then, but and that's when I'm really going to go for the crazy stuff in life, right? But the rest of the time, he's on to you spiritual people. Or does God only look after me in the times of my life when I'm getting it all perfect? Because that happens frequently, Ben. What is it restricted to? Well, look at 4 word pairs in this psalm to understand how big and wide and expansive the boundaries are. What this psalmist does is he uses word pairs describing opposite boundaries just to show us how large the space is where God covers us. Look at verse 2. He says that this is the God who made heaven and earth. What's not included between heaven and earth? Some of you, like Ben, on the weekends, I try to get outside of heaven and earth. It's a little bit crazy. No, there's nothing between heaven and earth. That's the whole point. That's what God's done. And then when you get into, into verse 6, he says that God will actively guard you by day and by night. You're like, but Ben, what about dusk? What about dawn? They're included. This is what the psalmist is doing. He's like, hey, this is not a small space. This is an expansive space. This is wide boundaries. This is as wide as you can have from one extreme to the next. Well, what's the next one? Anybody see the next one? Verse 8. It's always great when you know everybody's following along. Like, guys, I've been with this all week. I'm trying to teach you something. You're going out and you're coming in. What does that not include? Nothing. It includes everything. And when will he do it? Will he do it in 2 years? Will he do it when I learn a little bit more about my Bible? Will he do it in a leap year? Like, when's he going to do it? And he answers that at the end. What does he say? From this time forth and forever. What's not included? Nothing. He's trying to say to us that he is actively guarding us with anything, anywhere, anytime. But it begs another question, and the question is this, and you would be right to ask it. Is there a space in our lives where God doesn't actively guard us, where God is unwilling to take responsibility for us? The answer is yes. When you and I live outside of God's will for our lives, when we insist on having our own way, we cannot assume that God would take responsibility for us. Has he given us choice? Yes. Therefore, he's not going to take responsibility for anything that we do. Many of you remember one of the best stories Jesus ever told, Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son, where the son asked his dad for his inheritance, and the son went off and he squandered it. It said he spent it on wild living and prostitutes. And he left everything. The father's heart for his son was broken during that season, but the father could not take responsibility for the actions of the son. Does that make sense? Once he said, here's the money, here's the freedom, go for what you think will do it for you, the father wasn't responsible for the son's motives. The father wasn't responsible for the son's moves. He wasn't responsible at all. And so if you're in a place in your life and you're wanting God to actively guard you, but you're wanting to live contrary to his ways, I just need to tell you the truth this morning. He's not actively guarding you. He's not taking responsibility for your sin. He's not. He can't do it. If you want to look to other idols in the place of God, if you want to put yourself on the throne, if I want to put myself on the throne, it'd be crazy for me to say, hey, God, I'm going to worship myself, or I'm going to worship money, or I'm going to worship this other thing, but I still want you to do your part, not being God in my life, just being my protector. He's like, I can't take responsibility for that. You know anybody in your life? I think we probably all do. They're living life in such a way. It's a family member. It's a daughter. It's a mom. It's a spouse. They're living a certain way, and you know they're living and doing the kinds of things that God can't take responsibility for. But you don't have to be hopeless. So the father in the prodigal son story didn't take responsibility for his son's actions. His heart was broken over his son, and he longed for God to bring his son to his senses, and God did. Are you living a life that God is able to take responsibility for? Not perfectly. Not perfectly. But are you living a life where you're putting God in his rightful place and he's willing to be responsible for it? I want to finish this message and this entire series with 2 verses that have been meaningful for our church that we have leaned into long before we ever had our first service. And these verses, not only did we lean into them in the beginning when we were so desperate, like super desperate, like will a person show up? Will this work? Will it be killed? I mean, whatever. Like, will this church work? But this is a word for us today at this stage of our church. And it's a word for you today at this stage of your career. And it's a word for you today at this stage of your relationships, at this stage of raising your kids, at this stage with all the uncertainties. Here's the word for us that I want to just finish with today. It's Psalm 127, verses 1 and 2. It says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early. Everybody's like, thank God. I thought that was in vain. I thought that was pointless, Ben, when the alarm went off this morning. Yeah, you 11 o'clockers have so much to complain about. But unless the Lord builds a house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Unless the Lord, this is the reality of your life. You don't have to embrace it. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to ascribe to it. But if God doesn't give you your next breath, you don't have a next breath. Unless the Lord, this is the reality of our church. It doesn't say unless you have a great preacher. It doesn't say unless you have great music. It doesn't say unless you have a great facility. It doesn't say unless you hire the right staff and have the right leaders. I think all those things are important. I think God uses our best. But I'd be crazy to go, oh, God, thanks for getting us here. We'll take it from this place forward because we have a 10-year lease. Because I have a great staff team. I think I do. No, God, unless the Lord builds it reality. But hey, think about this. But if the Lord would build it, then all things become possible. Your financial situation can find redemption. Your marriage situation can find redemption. You can find salvation. I mean, this is what God has done for us. And what's awesome is I want to urge you to remember that you live in an unless the Lord reality. And because that is your reality, why not go for it? Why not let God take responsibility for things that you can't handle? Why not say, hey, God, this is crazy. I don't have it. What did Paul tell us in Corinthians? When we are weak, then we are strong. If we die, then we live. Whoever's last will be first. God is able to do more with what you put in his hand, no matter how your abilities or capabilities are, than the most wealthy person in this room and the most intelligent person in this room. Here's what's amazing. The most intelligent person and the wealthiest person in the room, they're here with their natural abilities and what's just on the table. You might be right here. I understand this is kind of where I play, but you know what it does? It opens up the possibility that you could see God do more. You could pursue more than this person could ever dream of, unless they also get to the end of their rope and go, God, I don't want to, you've given me a lot. I thank you for it. You're responsible for this. But God, I don't want to just settle for this. The world says this is the top. God, I want to see your top. I'm tired of living with limits. I'm tired of thinking my limits have to limit God. Embrace your limits. Rest. Some of you, I was about to say some of you, but no, I'm guilty. Some of us in this room, we live with constant pressure, exhaustion, and anxiety. Do you know why? Because we're trying to do the job that wasn't given to us. You're a great person. You make a horrible God. So why don't you rest? Why don't you leave a couple items undone on the to-do list? Why don't you relax a little bit? Why don't you trust? Why don't you open yourself up to things that your resume can't get you, your experience won't afford you, your intelligence isn't enough for? It's your story already. Make it an amazing story. Brad and I had dinner and this past Wednesday together. Brad, our worship pastor, and it was great just to catch up. And we talked about the last 5 years. And then Brad said it exactly right after we, this and that. Remember when our kids were 2 when we moved and blah, blah, blah. And he said, yeah, man, when we look back, the only thing we can say is only God could have done this. Some of you are insisting on living a life where you can look back and say, only I could have done this. That's a small life. That's a boring life. It's a self-centered life. I want you to shift whatever you need to agree with the psalmist. My help comes from the Lord. If he'll actively guard me, I can trust him. He can do things in my life that I don't have to be responsible for. Make a shift. For anyone in this room who is a follower of Jesus, who would call themselves a Christian, if it's true, here's what it means. It means that you've found the ultimate answer to the psalmist's question in verse 1. What's his question? From where does my help come from? And if you're a Christian in the room, what it means, just so you know that we're all clear, Ben, it's sort of just my religious affiliation. No, that's not what this is. This is not a survey. This is like a life thing. It means that you've answered this question, where does my help come from? By looking to the cross of Jesus, what he accomplished for us on the cross, and through his resurrection, you're going hey, there's my helper. And what do we see on the cross related to Psalm 121? Here's what I want to submit. Jesus didn't receive any of Psalm 121 on the cross. Was he spared evil? No. Was God the shade on his right hand? No, if God's your shade, you're not asking, why have you forsaken me? So why didn't the one who could have helped himself more than we can help ourselves, why did he not help himself? The one who could have removed himself from the cross, the one who could have just killed people on the spot, he could have done whatever. The scriptures say he could have called a legion of angels, 144,000 of them or something. Why did he not help himself? So he could help you. So he could help me. Quit refusing his help. Let your pride go. Quit thinking that in your life, the heavy lifting is up to you. Be faithful. Use the gifts he's given you. Do your best. But let God do what only he can do. Would you pray with me? Church, I just want to speak what I think is a prophetic word for us this morning. I have to apologize to 9:30. I didn't have this then. I think your future and our future together in the city and what we want to see God do in the world, I think a lot of it's tied to whether or not we'll believe that our God is the God represented in Psalm 121. He's willing to take responsibility for a life that's dependent upon him, for a life that's lived according to his ways. Why don't you let him? Some of you recently have learned that you don't have what it takes, and so you can be depressed about that, or you can see it as a gift that God got you to the end of your rope so that you would start grabbing his rope. He's got you to the end of your limit so you would see that he's unlimited. He's actively guarding you. Anytime, any place, anywhere, by day or by night, in heaven and on earth. You're going out and you're coming in both today and forever. What shifts do you need to make? If we can help you, either today as a staff or leaders here or throughout the week, we love to grab coffee or lunch or whatever the case may be, just to hear what's going on and listen to where you're coming from. If there's a way that we can help you process this, we want to. God, I pray that you would settle this truth from today in our hearts. God, that when we would just quit asking the question, like, am I enough? And we would just say, is God calling me into this? And is God enough? Again, I want to, God, I know you want me to live a life dependent upon you. So God, may I not put stock in my abilities or my inabilities. God, may we not look to our talents to define everything that's going to happen in our lives. Help us to look to you. We lift our eyes up to the hills. Where does our help come from? Our help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He won't slumber. He's not going to sleep. The God who keeps Israel will not go to sleep. God, be the shade on our right hand. Protect us by day and by night. Keep us from evil. Keep our life. You are our keeper, both now and forevermore. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand. We're going to sing a song based on a historic creed that just says, hey, this is what we believe, and this is what it means for us.